Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of Cover 4 Live. My name is Brandon Adams. I've got Jeff Sintel and Connor Riley with me. We'll have Dog Nation's Mike Griffith coming up in just a couple of minutes. He is on the breaking news that has been unfolding over the course of the last few minutes, as Georgia will now know that it's playing a 10-game conference schedule this year. A lot of details to be unpacked with that. We will do all of that with you over the course of the next few minutes and take your comments on this edition of Cover 4 Live presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Connor and Jeff, let me start with what we know here. We'll deal with those facts for a moment, and then we'll start sliding into kind of what we don't know, and, of course, invite comments on both Facebook and YouTube there as well. As I said before, we do know the SEC will be playing a 10-game conference-only schedule this year. We know the start date will be September 26th for that. Much later, obviously, than the typical beginning of the season. There will be a mid-season open date for every team around the SEC. And every team in the SEC will also be off on the date of December the 12th, which leads to an SEC championship game later than it's ever been before on December the 19th. So that is, I believe, kind of what we know right now. September 26th start, 10-game season, all SEC opponents, couple bye weeks mixed in the fold, and an SEC championship game on December the 19th. Jeff Sintel, did I leave anything out? And of these facts, what jumps out to you as being interesting here off the top? We'll let Jeff unmute himself there.
Fantastic.
There you go, Jeff. Go ahead.
$10 into the kitty for me. I think the whole concept is very fascinating. It's like one of those creative schedules from an NCAA football game that some of the young pups on this feed adore and love. But, I mean, you've got all these dynamics that are working. You know, I think the easy thing everybody extrapolates is, you know, what is that popular thing on the internet where it's like the hold my beverage? See, I'm cleaning that up for the family audience here on the program, Brandon. But the ACC does like, oh, look at us. We've got Notre Dame and their legions of television viewers and their marketing and their big brand name and their Q rating. Oh, and then the SEC, we'd sure love for you to come play that one marquee game with us as well in the brand new ACC. And it really seems to me you've seen everything that's out there that the Southeastern Conference is going to do things its own way, which is play a 10-game schedule on its own. Looks like it's reflecting a lot of the principles that the NFL was adhering to in terms of delay. Let's see how it goes. Give yourself a little wiggle. I think the mid-season open date is fascinating, and I think that open date on December the 12th is fascinating as well. And, you know, there's a lot of things to unpack, but those are my first thoughts.
Yeah, Jeff, to follow up on that with you, we've seen the Miami Marlins obviously shut down for however knows long in the Major League Baseball because of the huge number of positive coronavirus tests they've had. We've also seen the Philadelphia Phillies, at least for now, suspend operations as well. They were the team that most recently played the Marlins. So just given the way that Major League Baseball is operating, sports outside of a bubble environment right now, they're showing you that some hiccups, I think, are to be expected. In fact, Bob Bowlesby, the Big 12 commissioner, has said we expect there to be some interruptions along the way. So, Jeff, it would seem like by buying yourself those 2 extra weeks, you know, for a little bit of spillover, maybe rescheduling if that's what needs to be done, you're just increasing the likelihood that you're able to get this full season in.
Yeah, I think, Brendan, for me, the big OMG that everybody will love during talking season, which will now be the next 2 weeks of the schedule generation and also what's going to happen during the week. But can you imagine? I don't know. Maybe this is me not being entirely half full on this, but I can see the SEC might have 10 games scheduled and maybe hope for 6 or 7 of them to get played. And good gosh almighty, Joe Friday, if Georgia's canceled games end up being 2 of the easier games on the schedule, and then they retain all their harder opponents, whereas maybe a Florida and Alabama, the games that they lose would definitely not be something that they could lose on any given Saturday.
Connor, how about you? What jumps out to you about what we've learned today about the number of games, when they'll start, when the season for now is pegged to end with the late SEC championship? What's interesting to you about that?
I think it's the start date that jumps out the most to me here. You see that Big 12, Oklahoma and Kansas earlier this week moved up their first games to August 29th. The ACC announced very specifically games can start on September 7th, which was the date of Georgia's game against Virginia. And they'll play that weekend, I guess, on September 12th, that Saturday. Georgia and the SEC will not play first till September 26th. That's basically almost a full month from when some other teams can first play. But I think the reason in doing that makes a lot of sense, because by that point, you'll have seen how some games work out with the NFL, and you'll see how Major League Baseball to that point will have essentially completed its season. And those two professional leagues, I think, are going to offer a very good and handy roadmap for how the SEC is about to go and try and navigate the schedule. And perhaps most importantly, I think starting September 26th, what that does is it allows you to sort of see the impact that having students back on campus has on these football teams, and specifically, the addition of those students, the more variables you have there, the higher potential risks you have. And if teams are able to sort of control and contain their environments and not have COVID strikes on campus or outbreaks on campus, you potentially set yourself up better to actually play a full season schedule, I think.
The other thing I'll say here is, I'll be very clear about this. While the coronavirus is an incredibly serious issue that has rocked the entire world, not just the sports world, I do think to a degree college football has been unfairly maligned for trying to have a season when you haven't seen that for Major League Baseball. You haven't seen that for the NBA. You haven't seen that for the NHL. And more importantly than that, Connor, a point that you bring up, you haven't seen that for colleges themselves. I don't know that this was the intention of the SEC, but I believe a latent benefit of them delaying until September 26th is they allow the academic community, the university community, not just the SEC schools themselves, but colleges all across the country, for the most part, with rare exceptions, which are trying to have students on campus and somewhat business as usual, the college experience. They allow those colleges not just to go first and kind of work out some kinks of some potential outbreaks, but also provide some potential PR cover. Because for whatever reason, college football, in a way that other sports have not, you can decide for yourself the reasons why, but college football, in a way that other sports have not, has been forced to fight a PR battle over even restarting a season. So let the colleges go first, remind the world that college itself is not stopping for the coronavirus. Therefore, why should college football necessarily have to do the same thing?
Yeah, I think that last point you make there is the most important one, in that I think the SEC moving their start date back to when they did shows that, hey, we understand that this is still college football, and the college part is still very important and very intricate to what we want to do in the SEC. The SEC is still, Greg McGarity, talking with reporters, is still mentioning the possibility of having fans at these games, and having college students be a part of the environment is, I think, what makes college football what it is. And when you see some of these other conferences, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the ACC, going to sort of the models they are and saying, hey, we still want to start early to take advantage of potentially the SEC stepping back, I think it shows more that the sport really is more, it's about the money than necessarily the college athletes and the college students and campuses that are potentially most at risk in this situation.
Jeff, we'll also get Mike Griffith on this topic in a moment, who's with Greg McGarity right now. But the one thing that we are hearing matriculating out of this meeting with McGarity is, for the fans that are allowed in Sanford Stadium, we don't yet know how much that'll be. We can assume it's greatly reduced capacity. Those fans will be mandated to wear masks. This coming from Greg McGarity, not a huge surprise, given the fact that you, for the most part, see masks everywhere you go now, not always outdoors. Certainly Sanford Stadium's an outdoor venue, but not a surprise to hear a mask mandate, just given how prevalent masks have become around the country.
Yeah, a lot of the thinking there seems very logical about, why would you want to go home and home in that series and open up yourself to having the home venue with very little fans this year versus the next year, your opponent. I think I heard a gentleman tell me earlier today that when let them have 100,000 maniacs in their building, that doesn't seem equitable. We're kicking around a lot of the right topics. And, I think one of the things that, forgive me, guys, I'm just going to think SEC here and not WHO or CDC here. But that's September the 26th start date. And I can't believe I'm the guy that's bringing this up first, but it's going to give JT Daniels a lot of time for that knee to get right.
Yeah.
I mean,
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
We're talking football.
Yeah.
And that, my friends, is a football crackpot realist type theory there about that's going to be a lot of time to get a lot of things ready. You know what, Connor, that point you made a second ago, the thing that went through my mind was, wouldn't it be ironic if the other schools have a hiccup with their return to normal, return to schools, and they have to delay a couple of weeks, and then it ends up everybody starting around the same time. And then that would be the SEC's schedule just meaning more as well. And I guess, here's the thing. We're going to talk about all this up A to Z. But, it's funny. When I started explaining this to my wife about an hour ago, she had 19 million questions. And I'm sure all you guys have lots of questions. I want to tell you where my mind went after about the first, big pinky toe I put in the water is, and there's no answer to this, but I think that's something we got to say. There's no answer to this right now we don't know what happens after December the 26th.
That's right.
Conceivably, you could have a 10-0 Georgia, win the SEC championship game in 11-0, and then wonder, do I get to play 2 more games? That's where the college football playoff will kind of take over from there. I would imagine the logical thing they would do there is look at rankings, and they would continue to have rankings during the season because there wouldn't be a lot of interconference games. But you would have to think that an unbeaten SEC champion coming out of a conference-only schedule would have to be the number 1 team in the country, and maybe even a 1-loss SEC team would be the number 2 team in the country.
And Connor, we've heard from Bill Hancock, the executive director of the College Football Playoff, who has said emphatically that the playoff will be ready for whatever the rest of college football decides to do. The playoff is populated by the other conferences. As Jeff says, it's all about the money that's made there. So Hancock has been pretty clear about this. But Connor, the other thing that I'll add is, for the average fan, I think this could lead to a really frustrating conversation, because one of the things that we lean on during the typical college football year, let's just assume for a minute that these games are played, that everyone gets to have their conference-only schedule. One of the things that we lean on, the data point that comes when a Georgia beats a Notre Dame or Auburn beats an Oregon, we say not just, well, this team's better than that team, but that conference may have gained by that win. This year, you've got no apples-to-apples comparisons. It'll literally be teams racking up records against their own foes. I mean, go back and look at just SEC-only records the last couple of years. You do not see a lot of goose eggs in the loss column in the SEC for many of the teams that have played here in recent years. To think that you're going to be comparing records for teams that have played such different schedules, for the average fan, that leads its way to a very maddening conversation, I'd say.
First of all, Jeff brings up the possibility, if a team goes 10-0 and wins the SEC title game with an unbeaten record, much like LSU did a season ago, if Georgia does that, whenever that game is played, I believe December 19th, that December 21st show, BA will walk in, pound the desk of Dog Nation Daily and say, we don't even need a playoff. Let's just go ahead and crown Georgia the champion right now. We already know the SEC is the best conference.
I'll date myself with a reference, but it'll be like when John McGraw was the manager of the New York Giants and refused to play the World Series. There's no need to go and play anymore beyond that. I think that's right.
Right, but I think this year more than any, the eye test, how you actually look against the teams you play is going to be more important than ever. Style points, there's some debate about how much those really matter. Yeah. Style points matter more than ever. You think back to, I believe, the 2014 season when Ohio State was in that, 4, 5, 6, position to try and get in the playoff, and they put up 70 on Wisconsin, and that ended up getting them into the college football playoff. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. Teams not just trying to win, but trying to win emphatically. I think last year you look at that LSU-Georgia situation, if it's a scenario where those teams are 2 1-loss teams and the game still plays out like it does, I don't think LSU is taking its foot off the pedal and it's 37-10. It could be something like 54-10 to try and make a true statement, I believe. And then one thing, Jeff mentioned JT Daniels. I just want to put this out there for people wondering. The SEC has said Georgia practices and SEC practices will still start August 7th. So that's, I think, an important date. So now you essentially, with pushing back the season, you're getting those spring practices that you lost in adding those back into the schedule.
Freshman receivers,
JT Daniels, Jalen Carter. I think that's a really big. Those are the players I think that benefit the most that come to mind. Those freshmen that are coming in, those transfers that are coming in, that are going to get now those extra practices to get ready for that September 26th start date.
Jeff, real quick, then we got to move on. With the SEC championship game currently scheduled for December the 19th, I don't see how you have an early signing period in December this year. That's obviously speculation on my part. But, boy, it seems hard to do those events almost simultaneously. Am I on the right track for saying that?
No, I mean, Brendan, you gotta have some sort of signings because there's a lot of young people that want to enroll in January of 2021. Remember how those old school days where people signed a financial aid form and they just enrolled early without the pomp and grandeur of an early signing period? You got to remember, a lot of these kids are going to be graduating. The other thing you got to think about is, I don't know, what's it going to look like for recruiting visits? When are kids going to be allowed to make these visits? This might just be the aberration year where things just look a lot different. And remember the early signing period, guys, is it's always an off-ramp for you to get off the crazy town highway. If you want to get through with your recruiting and you want to end it, you can certainly do so. The other thing, I want to just jump into one thing right here, and I'm just thinking football here, guys. Yeah, guys, again, forgive me because I guess my brain wants to think football here. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to have these false positives anymore about football teams. Remember how you would look at like an Auburn, and maybe they would struggle with a Sanford or they would struggle with a Kent State, and you would be like, okay, that's how we know that Auburn is really not what they are. Maybe this will be the year where a lot of things have been put down by this pandemic, and I mean a lot of the things we enjoy or gotten used to in life. But you'll never hear this. Well, we're playing so and so we're not showing anything this week. We're holding back. We're saving that for the conference game 2 weeks later. I think when you play a lot of these games now and you're strictly SEC, there will be no more of that. They only beat so and so by so many. It'd be very interesting, Brendan. I think you'll have a whole week of shows, man, about what the schedule generator matrix looks like. And some teams might have a back-to-back juggernaut of 3 games, while others might have to slip in Arkansas, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, or Ole Miss in there.
Hold that thought because I want to pick up on that because that's very important to discuss. Let me remind folks who we are, what we're doing. My name's Brandon Adams. That was Jeff Sintel you just heard from. I've got Connor Riley here as well. Mike Griffith on the way. He's with Georgia Athletic Director Greg McGarity right now. This is Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau. And with offices in nearly every county in the state, Georgia Farm Bureau agents live, work, and play in your community and others like it. They provide support through important local agricultural programs, offer affordable home, auto, and life insurance protection. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. You can find them online. More information at gfbinsurance.com. That website, once again, is gfbinsurance.com. You can check that out with Georgia Farm Bureau, who brings Cover 4 Live each and every Thursday. Brand new time for us right here at 6 p.m. And that noise you hear there, the doorbell ringing, means that Mike Griffith is popping on after having spent some time with Greg McGarity. Let me set up our topic. I'll move in. I'll bring Mike Griffith into discussion as well because I want to hear some of what McGarity had to say. But Connor Raleigh, you wrote this piece at dognation.com, I think it was last night, heading into this morning, about, and I'll show you the tweet here from Ross Dellinger from SportsIllustrated.com, looking at if the SEC at the time, it was speculation, the 10-game conference schedule, that the games that would be added were the next 2 rotational games for each opponent, which for Georgia could have potentially meant Mississippi State and Arkansas, as Dellinger reported, and for a school like Florida, and I certainly had some fun with this morning on Dog Nation Daily, playing much tougher opponents, Alabama and Texas A&M. It has now been determined, Dellinger says it could be kind of a balanced strength of schedule thing. The athletic directors who've been quoted, I've seen Scott Strickland, the Florida AD, on this topic as a for instance. They're not saying much about this at all. It certainly seems like, Connor, what Georgia fans were setting themselves up for, a pretty big win, the Dogs adding 2 easy opponents, Florida adding 2 very difficult opponents. You have to push pause on that storyline, at least for right now.
Yeah, and I believe Ross Bjork, the Texas A&M athletic director, has come out and said, let's pump the brakes on potentially seeing that model. I believe Dellinger added this afternoon that they're going to sort of weigh a strength of schedule factor into that. So what does that mean for Georgia? Well, Alabama and Auburn were 2 of the best teams in the SEC a season ago. So there's a very likely chance, if you're trying to balance the schedule based on the 2020 or the 2019 strength of schedule results, you might still end up seeing an Arkansas and possibly a Mississippi State added to the schedule to balance that out. Now, from the Florida aspect, I'll make this brief. It is worth mentioning LSU went undefeated last year, and while that team doesn't figure to be as good as this season as it was a season ago, I think that might, certainly help Florida more than what they were looking at this morning, which is if they're playing the next 2 teams in their rotation, they're getting Alabama and they're getting Texas A&M. And even as the chief Gator hater himself here, that does not feel great for Florida.
Yeah, for sure. Mike, let me bring you on this because I know you've been with Greg McGarity. What did McGarity have to say? We'll get into a lot of what else McGarity had to say, but on the idea of scheduling in particular, we know it's 10 games, but beyond the 8 that Georgia was already scheduled to play, we don't really know what's coming next. What did McGarity have to say about all of that? All right, Mike is muted. We'll get him unmuted. Mike, unmute yourself there and let us know.
Hey,
still muted. Jeff, go ahead, and we'll pick up Mike.
He said that that they haven't decided yet, and they didn't want to decide before they voted because they were worried that if some of the other athletic directors knew who the extra 2 opponents would be, that might affect their decision on whether or not they wanted to go to a 10-game schedule. So they purposely did not deal with that. They said they would deal with the SEC commissioner very soon now as they start to work towards that 10-game schedule.
Yeah, listen, Mike, Connor just said I was the chief Gator hater, and I am. However, I got to be honest with you for a second. A lot of life comes down to practicality. Arguments are made to be won. If I was Scott Strickland, the Florida athletic director, and I knew I was about to be added an A&M and a Alabama to my schedule, whereas my chief rival, Georgia, was going to be added to Florida and Mississippi State, that benefits me as a UGA fan. But if I'm Scott Strickland, I couldn't have faulted him had he chosen not to go along with that. So if this is the byproduct that kind of got everybody to go along with this, saying, hey, we'll kind of rebalance some of these schedules a little bit, I kind of understand where certain people might have been coming from on that. I wouldn't have really stood by and wanted my school to get screwed by that either.
Yeah, and yet, as McGarity pointed out, there's 4 schools that have in-state rivals, but there's 10 that doesn't. If you're wondering why the SEC's not going with the +1 and why Georgia's not playing Georgia Tech or Kentucky, Louisville, or Florida State. So obviously everybody sits at that table and does what's best for themselves. And again, in this case, there's enough schools, though, that clearly wanted to go to this 10-game schedule.
Yeah, Jeff, what do you think about this in terms of what it almost was for Georgia? I certainly had a great time thinking about the Tide and the Aggies. I mean, let's face it, Jimbo Fisher owned Florida while he was coach of the Florida State Seminoles. Dan Mullen's record against the SEC West is, for the most part, pretty abysmal. The idea of adding 2 tough West opponents was really fun for me to consider. And, frankly, Georgia, if it could handpick 2 weak opponents, you couldn't pick much better options than Arkansas and Mississippi State. Now that's probably not going to happen, at least in that particular form, on the basis of the most recent reporting and the athletic directors who've been willing to go on the record about this. What do you make about just kind of where all this stands right now?
First of all, I'm going to have a little fun, Brandon. I think when everybody saw that headline pop across their phones this morning about rival, they all knew you were talking about Florida. Come on, man.
Of course.
That wasn't Auburn. That wasn't Tennessee. That wasn't the South Carolina Gamecocks. That was,
of course.
That was the what, Brandon? I hadn't heard enough this year.
The lousy, stinking games.
There you go. Sure. See, now we're just trying to get some likes and ups on the feed, but I just think we've never experienced this before, and I think that's the fun right of it. How you're going to get a lot more times. I've got 19 things going through my head. Number one, if you're playing all conference games, do you need to play red shirts as much, or some of these red shirts going to get their 4 games now? Will COVID issues mean even more needs to take these red shirts about how we'll try to figure out college football going forward? What does that mean for a lot of things? I keep saying it, like there's going to be some bona fide inequity here in terms of what if Georgia has to roll through Auburn, Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama back to back. And then some of the teams that they're competing against in the SEC East. Some of the teams they're competing against in the SEC East, man, they're not going through the same type of gauntlet that others are. People will chirp, people will whine, especially early in the year. And I think Brendan, I think this is the type of the part of the program, we can all just kind of kick this one around. But for me, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I think some of this might fix, you heard me right, fix some inequity in college football. I think what's being forced to say this year, and everybody's like, hey, difficult circumstances. I think this is the schedule that fans want to see. I think ESPN will pay more money for it. I think the SEC network will pay more money for it. Yeah. It's simply like inventory. When you go to your favorite retailer, I won't plug Brandon, and you go to those stuff on the end cap, the stuff on the end cap, and you're like, okay, give me the real stuff, the stuff I really want to see marked down. You don't want to see Georgia, East Tennessee State. You want to see Georgia, South Carolina. You want to see Georgia, Ole Miss. You want to see the storyline of Georgia playing Arkansas where it's Pittman and Smart and a lot of those guys they coached. I think this jacks up the volume right now for this season for college football. There won't be as many fans in the stands, but, Lord willing, cross those fingers, fellas. If the SEC rolls through with a 10-game conference-only schedule, folks, this might be the thing that saves the back half of 2020, because every week you're going to have one of those great football games. Remember those weekends we all hate where it's like, okay, LSU is playing Texas A&M this weekend, or LSU is playing Tennessee this weekend, and the rest of it is Georgia, Samford, and it's Florida versus Florida A&M. It's removing that from it. And the other thing, the ACC says right there is, they wiped out their divisions and they're going 1 through 15, 1 through 16. I like that a lot. And this is probably the part of the program where I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I don't mind Georgia Tech not being on Georgia's schedule anymore.
Yeah,
I can live with that.
We'll certainly get to the Georgia Tech part of this coming up in a little bit. Connor, how about the idea of the what we don't know about the schedule as of right now?
Yeah, I think, again, it'll be interesting to see when that comes out and what it ends up looking like. I do think, from a balance standpoint, a strength of schedule component is probably the most fair way to factor that in. Obviously, if you're playing LSU, that's a little bit more weighted in your favor. But then if you're playing, like, say, a team like Texas A&M, you might be more hurt by that because I believe A&M went 8-5 a season ago. But, they figure to be a whole lot better than that this season. I think Tennessee is another team, though. They actually, I think, ended up winning 7, 8 games. So, some teams in that situation might be hurt and help more than others. From Georgia's standpoint, though, I mean, they're almost with it being Auburn and Alabama being the two SEC West teams already on their schedule.
Yeah,
they're already almost guaranteed to get two of the worst teams on the SEC West side. So I think, and this is a reckless speculation prediction, I imagine it will be the two opponents Georgia ends up playing because they do absolutely have the toughest West slate this year. I believe they're going to end up playing 2 out of the 3 of Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss. Now, South Carolina will probably get 2 of those 3 as well because their games are A&M and LSU. So I think when Georgia's officially comes out, I would not be surprised to still see the Bulldogs with 2 of the weaker opponents in the SEC West.
Mike, let me bring you in on this because here's what I said this morning on Dog Nation Daily, that for the average fan, you hear Ole Miss, Arkansas, or Mississippi State, you treat that as really good news. I do think that Kirby Smart's viewpoint on this as a coach is like a little bit different. For instance, Ole Miss is not very good, but my gosh, they embarrassed LSU's defense last year, running the ball all over the place. John Rice Plumlee's hard to tackle. Kendall Briles, the Arkansas offensive coordinator, is former Broyles Award finalist. He's got a quarterback in Felipe Franks that started a bunch of SEC games. And Mike Leach has a history of putting up a lot of yards, a lot of points, and he's got a quarterback in KJ Costello from Stanford who, when healthy, has played really well. Listen, I'm not trying to oversell any of those opponents as a team likely to beat Georgia, but in a given year, if Georgia knew it was playing a Mississippi State, an Ole Miss, or an Arkansas, there would be a lot of preseason prep. Analysts working all summer long watching that film. There is a pretty annoying inconvenience if you're Kirby Smart and you find out, a few weeks ahead of time that you've got to go play this SEC game. Even if it's a team that's not very good, that's just not the typical protocol for how Smart would put a game plan together. Now, this year, you just got to go out there, roll up your sleeves, and win anyway. No excuses. But it is worth pointing out that for us, it's simple just to add 2 games to the 8 that's already there. But in terms of the regular preparation that teams like Georgia are used to, this is far different.
Yeah, it'll be different once the season starts. I could guarantee you right now, Kirby would tell you he's more worried about his own team than anybody's, especially with that complete made-over offense. One thing about Ole Miss, at least you got Matt Luke, and he would know the personnel there, and I would guess he would probably have a pretty good grasp of Mississippi State, with that being an in-state rival and a lot of the kids that he recruited. One advantage, I guess, for all these coaches, the control-free coaches, I guess, September 26th start date, BA. The question now, and one of the things that came out of the call with McGarity, we don't know when they can start practice. Originally August 7th, but remember that NCAA schedule that came out, it counted back 29 days from the opening game. Well, the opening weekend is no longer September 5th for the SEC. It's September 26th. So will the NCAA give the SEC a waiver to begin practice the first week of August with the rest of the country that'll start that September 5th weekend? Or will they have to wait now because they're starting 3 weeks later until the end of August before they can start practice? That's going to be one of the most important things that comes out in the news in the next few days, I think.
It's a Cover 4 Live presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau. And Mike Anderson watching us on Facebook said, my comment about, preparing for the opponents that Georgia will have to play, Mike said all the SEC teams will be in the same boat. And that's true. Jeff, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that I think part of the reason why the SEC, at least reportedly, was initially resistant to adding conference games is not just because it makes the schedule tougher, more SEC opponents typically would, but because it's just kind of a lousy inconvenience, right? I mean, it's like got to make everybody happy, not making one schedule way tougher than the rest. As we addressed before, you got to find a place to play these games, a time on the schedule to play these games. I think the SEC, is having to make the best of the situation. But I can't imagine anyone's that excited about trying to figure out a way to shoehorn 2 more games, new dates for a lot of these games. This is, I think, an undertaking behind the scenes that's a lot more intensive than just us talking about it on streaming video.
Yeah, I'm glad we got Mike on this call, so because I want to ask him. Maybe he's been privy to some backdoor shenanigans or whatever. But, guys, I have a hard time thinking that Georgia's final game of the season with clean old fashioned hate gone. Man, I would put a Coca-Cola on it. I would put a beverage on it, a gentleman's dollar bet that Georgia's last game of the year prior to the SEC championship game for ratings, for TV, for maximum splash, that's going to be South Carolina, Tennessee, or Florida. I think it just has to be that. I mean, dare say I don't think anybody in the conference office would make the Georgia-Alabama or Georgia-Auburn game the last game of the year. Maybe, because it might come back to November. But you got to think they've got the wiggle here, fellas, where they can have your de facto SEC East championship game the week prior to the SEC championship game.
Well, it won't be the week prior because there will be the week off prior to that, but certainly in the season.
Yeah.
As it stands now, in typical years, the SEC prohibits teams from having a week off prior to the SEC championships. You've got to play somebody. As Jeff said, that's typically Georgia Tech. We'll get to the absence, the Yellow Jackets here in a moment. But, Connor, one of the, backstories of Georgia-Auburn moving to October was the seeming desire to make the SEC East look a little more like the SEC West, where you have potential division-deciding games late in the year. Georgia-Florida has kind of a traditional date somewhere around the final quarter pole, but Georgia-Tennessee now much later, reminiscent of Auburn-Alabama playing in November, LSU-Alabama playing in early November. It seems like the league has tried to set up the SEC East so that it was a little bit more backloaded to match what the SEC West provides in that season's final month.
Right, and I would agree with Jeff's bet that it would be, I would wager a beverage, not a specific brand one, because we don't give out free advertising here. And I'll even go a step farther. I think the SEC, if they're going for the maximum splash, maximum potential, and Herb Vincent, the associate commissioner of the SEC, has recently clarified that they will still have divisions in 2020. I would venture to wager that if they were going for the max splash, most interesting final game of the year, that will be Georgia versus Florida in Jacksonville, which, as McGarity has said, will remain in Jacksonville as of this point for the 2020 season.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Brandon, can you imagine that? The last week of the SEC schedule has Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia, Florida on that same weekend. I mean, I
think it'd be great. I think it'd be great. I mean, Mike, how about you? I mean, in a year in which everything's so different anyway, why not play Georgia, Florida the last game of the year?
Well, because it's a tremendous disadvantage for both of those teams from a recruiting standpoint. You're talking about everybody in the league has December 12th off. That was something else that came out of the call with McGarity. So now the end of the regular season is December 5th. With the early signing date being December 18th, I would think these schools would want to have an opportunity to host recruits. And if you're Georgia, you've only got 4 home games. Everybody else has 5. And so you're going to want an opportunity to recruit that weekend. I mean, boy, you're right in the strike zone.
Well, hold on, they're going to have to play somebody, and Auburn's almost certainly going to be playing Alabama that week. I can't imagine Alabama's not playing the final week of the regular season. They're going to have to play somebody.
Something else to think about. A lot of schools, guys, I didn't mean to jump in here, but a lot of schools, like the state of Georgia, is delayed anyway. A lot of the elite prospects are going to be in the second, third round playoffs during a lot of those games, during a lot of those times. I think everything is going to be backed up as well.
Jeff, do you think, I know it's unfair speculation, do you think that visits are allowed by December?
Maybe December, man. You got to have numbers. But, man, I was talking to a major Georgia recruit this week, and he's been told by a lot of Georgia coaches from other SEC schools, man, they don't know when they're going to get kids back on campus again. And I think that timeline, we're talking about gentlemen's bets here. I don't even know if kids will be back on campus visiting October, November. I don't even know if it'll be that soon.
Yeah, it just seems like such a weird year for the recruiting part of this, for sure. Mike, we said before you joined us when you were still with McGarity, I said I almost wonder if you can even have the early signing period the way we've come to expect in the last couple of years. If there's no visits to lead up to that, Jeff brings up a good point that you're going to still have early enrollees. you certainly are. But somehow this does not feel like the kind of year where you can have 3 days worth of early signing period the way that it's been the last, I guess, going back to 2018, the signing class of 2018. Just doesn't seem like you can have that if you don't have visits predating all of that.
Yeah, you would think that they would want to move that back, but some of these coaches, they like those early enrollees coming into school, and I don't know any other solution other than to have them sign if you want them on campus in January. But to your point, BA, it's unfortunate because a lot of these kids are having to commit to schools, or maybe not having to, but choosing to commit to schools sight unseen just to have the safety of a commitment. I don't know how many stick and how many don't. I don't know when the visits start. I do know McGarity said on that call that all fans in Sanford Stadium would have to wear masks. So obviously they're moving forward with protocol, even if they don't know how many people will be allowed. I've got to believe if they're thinking fans wearing masks, that you're also thinking recruits will be allowed in on Saturday.
And listen, I commend the SEC for the mask mandate. The truth is, I've been to Knoxville. I've seen Florida fans. In most of those venues, fans wearing masks is a huge improvement over the typical face that you see when you go in those opposing stadiums. So from that standpoint, I commend the SEC for doing the right thing.
And I'll say Vanderbilt, if they're wearing bags over their head like they do traditionally, they're all set. They're ready to go for that.
Sure, no doubt about that. Mike, I'm going to throw you a bone here. Go ahead, Jeff.
Brandon, you'll accuse me of, again, bringing up this topic, but I think we got to talk about the negative here. We got to talk about the tragic thing here. And for all those Georgia seniors that signed in the class of 2017, they now lose the chance to beat Georgia Tech by 45 points again for the fourth time. You see, I think Richard LeCount showed up on my Twitter feed about 20 minutes ago about tweeting about how he will be undefeated for his career against Georgia Tech.
All right, clearly we will get to that. Let me do one thing before we get there, because there is a lot to be said about that. Mike, let me throw you a bone, because I know there's no topic more important to you than canceling the cocktail party. How sad are you right now that the cocktail party doesn't get canceled, that fun may be allowed to exist for another year here beyond the 2020 season? How disappointed are you today to find out that Georgia-Florida remains in Jacksonville?
Well, I don't know if disappointed is the word. I just think it's interesting when you talk about protecting the student athletes and you care more about protecting tradition. I mean, you can't get around the fact that getting on an airplane for a designated home game doesn't make sense amid the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, I know we joke about it, but if it's my kid or it's your kid and there's a school that's putting them on an airplane instead of playing a home game, that's crazy to me in a COVID-19 year.
But hold on. Now, Mike, you have been as much pro-football return as anybody that I've heard from on Dog Nation Daily. How is it safe to play football in general, but too dangerous to go to Jacksonville?
Well, I'm talking about giving up a designated home game. That's all I'm talking about. You get every team gets the same amount of allotted home games, Brandon. And, Georgia's given up one of their home games because they want to protect tradition more than they want to protect their own kids from having to travel unnecessarily. I just don't understand.
Are you going to go on record in saying it's more dangerous for Georgia to play in Jacksonville than it is to play in Columbia, Missouri, or Columbia, South Carolina? Or
no.
Well, then
but
what
I
are
am
you
going to
talking
go
about?
on record. I am going to go on record and say it's more dangerous to travel to Jacksonville than it would be to play a home game in Athens, where there's no travel. Are you going to disagree with that?
Yes, I do disagree with that.
You don't think it's more dangerous to get on an airplane
because you're
fly in Jacksonville than play in Athens, Georgia without that travel?
Because you're going to be playing road games anyway. It'd be one thing if you were playing in a bubble, but that's not how that series works, Mike, and you know it. Home and road for the Georgia-Florida game is nothing more than jersey color. You know that.
You better tell that to Texas A&M, because they're saying they're not going to play in Arlington. They're going to use their designated home game and play in College Station.
You're right, and that's fair to bring that up. But the big difference there is that Ross Bjork, the Texas A&M AD, has been very clear that he doesn't want to keep playing the game in Arlington. Now,
and Kirby Smart has made it clear he doesn't want to continue after.
Well, you know what? When Kirby Smart wins a national championship, he can cancel the cocktail party. But until then, he's going to keep going down to Jacksonville. How about that?
Well, the models worked great the last 40 years.
Hey, well, let me be serious for one thing, and then we'll move on, Mike. But in all seriousness, I know that there are fans that don't want Georgia and Florida to play in Jacksonville, but the two schools still do. That's the big difference between Arkansas and A&M, where A&M clearly doesn't want to play in Arlington anymore. And for those who don't know, they played a neutral site in Jerry World the last few years. They've been in Arlington. A&M doesn't want to. Arkansas seems ambivalent, although Juricic, the however you say his name, the athletic director, I don't think he wants to make his big booster Jerry Jones mad. But Arkansas A&M is a very different situation because at least one of those schools wants out of that agreement.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the people on record. I know it's interesting to me though when you talk to the Jim Donnans and Mark Ricks and Kirby Smarts, and they point out that it's really not a neutral site. And you talk to some of the players, and you know, when you say Georgia wants to do it, I think you're talking about a select group of administrators that probably don't have much time left on the clock. Now, the game, obviously, McGarity said, as Connor alluded, it will be there unless something changes. He did throw that clause in there. I don't know if anything's going to change or not. I do know the contract expires in 2023. And one of the reasons Greg gave for not wanting to play the game in Athens was the fear of having to go back and play in Gainesville next year. He said, why play a game in front of 25,000 in Athens this year when you're going to have to go back and play in front of 93,000? I guess Greg's got a crystal ball and COVID-19 is going to go away and we're going to have full attendance next year. But the reason why you would do it is because you've got a national championship team this year with that defense. I don't know what next year looks like.
All right, we're going to let Jeff talk about Georgia Tech. I do want to do that. Connor, you want to jump in on this topic before we move on?
No, I want to save my big speech for Georgia Tech because
right,
I think it's far more important I weigh in on that than this Florida battle.
It's Cover 4 Live. That's Connor Riley you just heard from. My name's Brandon Adams. Mike Griffith here just after getting off the phone with Greg McGarity, the Georgia Athletic Director. Jeff Sintel, of course, as said before, always brought to you by the Georgia Farm Bureau, always the home team. We'll do this at 6 p.m. every Thursday throughout the season, and what a season's going to be, as we have found out today. We appreciate you being here as a part of Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing those Cover 4 articles showing up at DogNation.com as well throughout the season. All right, so because of the 10-game conference-only schedule that the SEC is going to play, that does bring now, at least for this year, a cancellation of the rivalry known as Clean Old-Fashioned Hate, a historic rivalry, as I said on Dog Nation Daily today, a rivalry that has a name, a rivalry in which Georgia has a jersey retired for a player who performed well in this series. That's the only reason why his jersey's retired, the drought breaker there in Sap. This one comes to an end for the first time since 1925. I had Mr. College Football Tony Barnhart on Dog Nation Daily today. I asked Tony what it meant for college football for these two teams not to be playing. Here's what Tony had to say.
They've been playing so long. They played through so much, and those games needed to be played. And I was thoroughly convinced there would be a non-conference option in all of this for the SEC, and it may still be, but I just don't think you say goodbye to Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina, and Florida, Florida State, and Louisville, Kentucky. You just don't do that. That's one of the things I'm disappointed in. I understand these are extraordinary circumstances, and sometimes they require extraordinary decisions.
All right, Jeff, so you hear from Tony Barnhart there. That's a historian. That's a guy that knows football in the state of Georgia. What is the absence of Georgia, Georgia Tech? And we presume this is only going to be for 1 year. But what does the absence of Georgia, Georgia Tech mean for you?
I think it's you brought up there in Sap, so immediately my mind traced it. I think that's a relic of the 1940s and 1950s. Chan Gailey, George O'Leary made that a much more competitive rivalry, but I just look at it objectively, and I think these two programs are on different edges of the food chain in this conference, in their respective conferences. This is my thing with Georgia, Georgia Tech. I respect it. I know there's great tradition. I'd love, in a perfect world, for the home of the Georgia, Georgia Tech football game to be the Chick-fil-A Classic about every 2 or 3 years. I think that would juice up the rivalry, because you wouldn't have the competitive swings one way or the other. I think Jeff Collins is doing great things building that program up. I think they'll have a better talent base. I think Tech will have top 30, top 40 talent for the next 4 or 5 years under Jeff Collins. But I think you make that game more special by putting it in Mercedes-Benz. You put it at the beginning of the year, and it maybe the argument is lessened because Tech's no longer running the triple option, and it's the antiquated offense that Georgia had to spend practice time for the whole season preparing for, and cut blocking, and it's right before their really important games of the year. Now that Georgia has ascended with Kirby Smart to being a team that's usually in the SEC East championship race and playing in the SEC championship game, I think that rivalry has morphed a lot. Whereas I'd much rather find a way for Georgia to get maybe every 4 years 2 games with Clemson and then 2 games with Georgia Tech or somebody else special like that.
Connor, I don't disagree with Jeff on this. While I am a huge proponent of the history of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, that's a series that's fun to be a part of. Unfortunately, Georgia went through a long period of time where it wasn't winning there. Now Georgia is winning, but the cocktail party itself has always been one of the things that makes college football great. No one outside of the state of Georgia thinks of Georgia Tech as a great rivalry. In my opinion, no one thinks about the rivalry at all. If Tech and Georgia never played again, I honestly wouldn't care.
Let me stump for this. And I've been watching a lot of Aaron Sorkin recently, so excuse me if it sounds a lot like this.
Please.
I grew up in Metro Atlanta. The first game I went to was a Georgia Tech football game. The two colleges that had the most kids from my high school, Centennial High School in Roswell, Georgia, go Knights, was Georgia and Georgia Tech. I think in the Metro Atlanta area, this game does still have some significance, especially just given the proximity and how many Metro Atlanta area kids end up going to Georgia. They have played this game every year since 1925. They played it through a world war. They've played it through ups and downs. They've played it when Georgia Tech was winning a national championship in 1990. They have played it when Georgia was winning one in 1980. This rivalry is, I think, like many of the other rivalries, like the cocktail party, and why I'm such an ardent proponent of keeping that game in Jacksonville is because what makes college football in particular special are these traditions. Because the reality is college football on a football basis is nowhere near as good of football as the NFL is. I don't think any of you would disagree with that. Is that correct?
Sure.
So what makes college football special? There's no technically here. What makes college football special? It is these traditions. It is these rivalry games. What makes BA, to your point about Georgia and Florida and the way that rivalry has swung back and forth, what makes beating Florida so sweet is the agony that comes with those losses that you've had to experience with them?
Of course.
I think that same reason, because of the fear and the worry of the agony of losing to Georgia Tech and how much losing to Georgia Tech is the absolute worst thing. And while I understand having a win over Georgia Tech doesn't keep the same thing, at some point, like all rivalries, I think it's going to go and have its ebb and flows. To Jeff's point, Jeff Collins is building something better in Georgia Tech, and I think he can make Georgia Tech a very interesting and quality football program that is especially attractive to athletes that have to meet the higher academic standards at Georgia Tech. And as Stanford sort of struggles and Northwestern does as well, I think that opens the door for Georgia Tech to continue to do well in the Metro Atlanta area.
Mike, what do you think?
I think that's a small part of the world. I think that Georgia has become a national championship contender. And I think you've got to make decisions that are in the interest of becoming a national championship contender. Look, I appreciate rivalries. Connor's right, but my goodness, you already have enough of them. Tennessee will tell you they're a rival. Auburn will tell you they're a rival. I certainly think Alabama has evolved into a rival. You see them every year. South Carolina will tell you Georgia is their biggest SEC rival. Auburn is a rival. The problem here is that Georgia Tech hasn't taken care of business. And the only way this game has any interest is if Georgia loses. Best case scenario is that Georgia Tech gets good enough to make it a good game. And if Georgia Tech does get good enough to make it a good game, they get good enough to recruit against you. It's an absolute no-win scenario for Georgia football to play Georgia Tech. It's not a good road trip for your fans. Most of the boosters give their tickets away. It's an old, aged, out-of-date stadium. It's not a fun road trip for anybody from Athens to go to downtown Atlanta. You can do that any day of the week. The rest of the country turns a complete blind eye to this. And, Connor, for all those wonderful Atlanta area students, I can tell you they're not taking their official visit that weekend to Georgia Tech unless they're the booby prize, because all the really talented kids are at Alabama, Auburn, or Florida State, and Georgia Tech has absolutely zero relevance. You think about last year's game, and the scoreboard said one thing, but the reality said another. I saw a Georgia Tech guy come up, put a kamikaze hit that knocked himself and ultimately DeAndre Swift out of that game. You lost your marquee player essentially for the rest of the season playing against somebody who was playing in their Super Bowl that day. We saw a Georgia Tech guy lure your best receiver into a fight. George Pickens got ejected and was thus suspended for the first half of the LSU game. You essentially lost any chance you had of beating LSU when DeAndre Swift got injured and George Pickens was ejected. Wow. What a great rivalry game.
Yeah, but I don't think that happened. But I mean, at least in the Swift injury, I don't think that happened because of Georgia Tech. Connor, how would you respond?
Yeah, I would say to the rivalries being important, I believe in my state, first of all, that Georgia Tech is one of the signature rivalry games. I don't consider South Carolina a rival, but the great thing about Georgia is that depending on where you grew up in the state, different rivalries mean different things. Jeff, you grew up in North Georgia. I imagine playing Tennessee means a little bit more to you than it does potentially people who grew up in the south side of Georgia, especially when Georgia and Tennessee weren't playing each other every year throughout the 80s. Is that correct?
I'll give it. Let me say one more thing here, Connor. It's an example of this is kind of like I'll use a couple of other states just to put it into perspective, because when it's emotional, it's hard to be rational. And obviously Connor grew up around this rivalry and loves it, and nobody wants to take a rivalry away. But at some point, LSU decided that playing Tulane every year wasn't in the best interest of their program. And Tennessee decided that playing Memphis was, and you sit back and say, Tennessee, Memphis, who cares? LSU, Tulane, who cares? And it gives you some perspective. And part of what's happened here, guys, is that Georgia is all grown up now. And Georgia's the big kid on the block, and they don't need to play their little brother in the backyard anymore. There's other great programs around that Georgia, if they want to stay on this national stage and cash in on this window of talent and this mercurial young coach, they are an annual national championship contender. It's time to move on from the Pat Dye, a former Georgia Bulldog, a Georgia man, if ever there was one, in the Jacksonville Hall of Fame. The first guy to tell you, doesn't make sense to play that game there. First guy to tell you, Georgia Tech rivalry, not what it once was. He was a visionary. He grew Auburn, took the game out of Birmingham. Georgia's in a position now, guys, to take a step forward and stay on this national stage where they've belonged for years when you look at the amount of high school talent. Everybody's looked at Georgia and called them an underachiever for decades and decades and decades, because you have some of the best high school talent, some of the biggest number of FBS recruits, and yet you haven't won a title in 40 years because
Jeff,
of this
jump in on
model
this.
that you're stuck to.
Jump in on this, Jeff, and I want to give Connor the last word on this topic. Jump in, Jeff.
So, I'm just gonna spitball a lot of things here. Number one, your rivalries become rivalries when the other side wins. I don't like the way the Georgia Tech rivalry has evolved as to where that team plays at Georgia every cycle with nothing to lose. I think Mike's points there about, let's take down Georgia. This is our last game. This is our Super Bowl. But here's clearly what I think. Number one, get to the point, Georgia Tech, where you're not having to sell 3 and 4 game ticket packages and dropping the Georgia Tech ticket in there in order to get sellouts for the rest of your games for the season, in order to fill the seats, in order to act like you're a big boy, a really big boy football program. Georgia used to play a lot of teams. They used to play Mercer. They used to play Yale. They used to play Tulane. They used to play some of those original members of the SEC. They don't anymore. Yeah, I just feel that, I get that. I'm a nostalgia guy, but I think when it's almost like a yin and yang. If you want the Georgia game, the Georgia-Florida game in Jacksonville for all those special reasons, we'll say for another show, then the Tech game at the end of the year, non-conference, complicates the rest of your schedule. That's why I think it should be a great Chick-fil-A Classic game every 2 or 3 years. And I think that's when that game becomes a little more special than what it is right now, because that game has no energy whatsoever.
Well,
Bill O'Reilly style, I'll give you the last word, Connor.
If it's going to be played in a neutral site game, there's no energy there either. I think either play them every year or don't play them. I certainly would agree with Mike's point there. One, if you're playing Clemson every year and you're playing the other quote unquote big boys, be careful what you wish for there, because you might start losing some of those games and it becomes very apparent and obvious that you're not on that level. And to just sort of close everything out, again, if you want to make this purely about money and purely just the biggest games and the biggest names, that's fine. But then don't try to sell me this as this is what college football is, because that is so clearly what it has not been for the past 100 years of the sport.
We will leave it right there on this topic. Cover 4 Live. That was Connor Riley. I'm Brandon Adams. Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel here as well. We're brought to you by Georgia Farm Bureau, always the home team and doing a great job of taking care of folks all around the state of Georgia and the communities where they live. And us here on Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau every Thursday at 6 p.m. here as well. Let me move on to the topic that has led to the cancellation of Georgia Tech for this year. The fact that the ACC struck first, 10-game conference-only schedule, adding Notre Dame as a playing member of the league for this year. SEC decides to close the door for the non-conference matchup that the ACC was open to by announcing a 10-game conference-only schedule for itself. Pat Forty from Sports Illustrated had an interesting take on some of this yesterday, writing about the ACC's move, essentially saying at the time it was a step up from where things were, I should say a big response to the SEC. So what Forty writes for Sports Illustrated is that John Swofford, the outgoing ACC commissioner, by beating the SEC was a genius maneuver, scheduling and then simultaneously putting the onus of canceling the traditional SEC-ACC rivalry games on that league by announcing a desire to play one non-conference game, but not identifying the opponent, Pat Forty says, beyond saying it had to be played in their home state. The ACC basically threw 100 gallons of paint around the corner and made the SEC stand in it. Forty went on to say essentially that if these rivalry games didn't get played, which now they're not going to, that we would know who to blame. It'd be the SEC that shoulders the blame for that. Mike, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of gibberish and politics and self-important writer. And I love Pat, but I think he gets carried away sometimes. Nobody was painted into any corners. The SEC had already discussed these different models. The SEC is not getting bullied by anybody. The SEC is the premium product in college football, and it's the ACC that took a gut punch by the SEC saying, you know what, after all, don't need that game. We would rather give our fans 10 SEC games. And guys, I'll tell you, I'm excited about that. Nick Saban and Kirby Smart have both been on record saying they would prefer a 9-game league schedule to an 8-game league schedule. I think that kind of prevents, it kind of washes out the chance that some teams will have an easier schedule in the league than others. Let's be honest. You were mentioning earlier about Florida BA and Scott Strickland, and boy, those Gators can whine. They sure do seem to get their way with a lot of things, when games are played and where they're played, et cetera, et cetera. But this year, they had such a distinct advantage in scheduling with Ole Miss and LSU instead of playing Alabama and Auburn, that some people were jumping off the bridge picking Florida to win the East simply because they recognized that Florida could lose to Georgia but still win the division because of the imbalance of the Western Division opponents. One good thing about a 10-game schedule is that's going to get canceled out a little bit. Now, I'm sure Florida's going to squawk and find a way out of playing Alabama and A&M, who would be the next two West Division opponents. They'll find their way out of that. They'll scheme their way out of that. Their media will cry foul and whine and complain. But in the meantime, I like the 10-game schedule that the SEC is going to. They don't need to worry about what the ACC is doing. I'll give the ACC credit for adding Notre Dame. Clemson might actually have an opponent that has similar talent to them. Might even have to play their starters into the fourth quarter of an ACC game this year with Notre Dame on the schedule. SEC is still quality. Nobody anything. They did what was best to protect the players, the league, and afford them the most flexibility this season.
Jeff, how about this on your end? It certainly looks to me like there's a little bit of an SEC-ACC feud. I think what the SEC did today was a pretty strong response to the ACC's original move. But frankly, I imagine the Atlantic Coast Conference feels pretty good about being able to add Notre Dame for this year. More money, a little bit more robust scheduling. How do you think all this shakes out now?
Yeah, Brendan, I think I hinted at this earlier. I think this all comes down to the color green and money. I think what the ACC did there is they enhanced their television product by including Notre Dame with some peacock feathers in there from the NBC package. And they also tried to get their hand in the SEC cookie jar as well. And the SEC said, all right, area regional rival, you do have your own network. I see what you're doing there. Here's how we can make sure our product remains the class of college football. We're just going to play each other 10 times. We're going to have an all SEC schedule. And we think our television partners, we think the advertisers, we think the buzz and the Q rating that comes out of these games will still be a lot stronger. And then that way we don't have to help the ACC retain a little bit of a puncher's chance in the national conversation as well.
Yeah, Connor, I have a sense, and this is only speculation on my part, but if you want to go back to the original athletic directors meeting of the SEC folks in early July, the consensus of the reporting coming out of that was the league did not want to play additional SEC games and wanted to maintain the either traditional rivalries or in the case of, like, say, Mississippi State, North Carolina State, Auburn, North Carolina, those SEC, ACC matchups that were there. The fact that the SEC comes out today and says 10 games, conference only, it really feels like a spiteful gesture. I called it a middle finger yesterday on Twitter. Am I wrong for saying it that way? Because I don't think this is what the SEC necessarily wanted to do, but I think it was happy to do it as a way of saying the ACC to the ACC, we're just not going to do business with you at all for a year. Am I wrong to say it that way?
No, I think the SEC by saying because I don't think the SEC, again, to your point, ever wanted to go to 10 games. And when it comes out that the Pac-12 is going to do that, that the Big Ten is very interested in doing that. And then the ACC comes out and does that. When you're trying to think of a theoretical college football playoff, having only played 8 conference games is certainly a knock against you. So when the ACC comes out, and I do think they tried to paint Georgia into a corner, or the SEC, into a corner, the SEC has said, no, screw this. We're just going to take our ball and go home. And we're not going to kowtow to what you guys want to decide to do for us. I do think, assuming it gets played, and I think the reason why the SEC maybe even wanted to go to an 8+1 schedule model is you sort of see when they push back the schedule to start September 26th, I think less games does give you a little bit more flexibility in there to try and get a complete season under. Whereas with these 10-game schedules, you're clearly just trying to get the most money in the biggest chunk of the pie. So with that in there, I commend the SEC for not, kowtowing to what the ACC tried to do and say, we're not going to play your politics. We're just going to try and do what is best solely for our conference. And in that case, 10, like Mike brought up earlier, 10 outweighs the 4.
All right, it's Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau. We'll close out every show every Thursday. Instead of Cover 4, we'll do Cover More. We'll give you a chance to weigh in with your own questions and comments, the subjects, the talking points that we haven't already addressed. We'll give you a chance to do that via the conversation before we wrap things up with myself, Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel, Connor Raleigh as well. In fact, let's dive in here and get a few of these comments right now. James Crump, speaking to Mike, says the problem is Georgia Tech, Georgia is ACC versus SEC. He says Tennessee, Memphis, or LSU, Tulane had no conference significance. Mike, does it change it for you knowing that Georgia Tech, as a part of the ACC, is of a larger caliber than the Green Wave would be, as a for instance, and a part of a series of SEC versus ACC rivalries that these two leagues share with each other?
Yeah, I really wish that would have mattered in 2018 when Georgia got left out of the house for Oklahoma. Unfortunately, playing another Power 5 conference team sway anybody, and in fact probably hurt them, because Georgia Tech has turned into a lousy program that's going nowhere.
I mean, I will say, Connor, I know you feel the strongest about Georgia Tech, but when I first started kind of getting sour on the idea of Georgia playing Tech every year, it was that lead up the 2018 season when you had people like Heather Dinich saying that Georgia's non-conference schedule was a joke when it included a Power 5, I guess it would have been a home game, but it included a Power 5 non-conference opponent, something that not everyone did back in 2018, right. And yet Georgia was getting no credit for it. So that's when I first started saying that if you're not going to get credit from the national media for playing the game, then what's really the point of playing the game when half the time the two fan bases pretend to ignore each other anyway?
Well, I would just ask, how many wins in Athens does Auburn have since 2006? Or I guess 2007, since they didn't play in Athens in 2006. Do you guys know?
They haven't won since then, right?
That's
they won in 2005.
Do you know how many Georgia Tech has?
They won in 16 and 14.
And I believe 2008. So that's 3. And
yeah.
Kirby Smart, I believe he's played one more game against Auburn. He has the same record against Auburn that he does against Georgia Tech. Now, obviously, that's an intellectually dishonest argument there. But I still think
we'll still accept those around here.
Yeah, I just, just because they're down now doesn't mean they're always going to be down. They were a top 10 program for portions of that past decade at times. So, yes, it is difficult right now, and I certainly understand that. But, tough times don't last. Tough people do. And so I'm going to continue to stand on what I know is the right side of history in this.
Another comment, Jonathan Kaysen on Facebook. This is a good one. I'm going to reword it, but I think it's important when I want to hear a yes or no from everybody, starting with you, Jeff. Given the fact that it's 10-game, conference only, certainly leading to a weirder postseason probably, is there an asterisk next to the eventual national champion this season?
No.
Mike?
Yeah, it should be for the team that does the best job dealing with adversity. That'd be an asterisk I'd be darn proud of.
Okay. Thank you.
So the answer to Mike's question is no. You see this with the NBA. You'll see this with baseball. I mean, at the end of the day, as long as there's still a playoff and the best teams are playing in that, I don't think there's any more of an asterisk than, a season where, I think back to the NBA, Derrick Rose tore his ACL after leading the Bulls to the best record in the NBA. Like, if you want to make the asterisk argument, there's asterisks on every title because there's just so many differing factions in every season. So I think as long as we see a 9-10 game regular season and then a college football playoff, I think this is still going to be regarded as a national title.
But you bring up Major League Baseball, and I'll turn this into a baseball show, and Jeff, I'll let you bounce in on this. When you're normally playing 162 game regular season, you only play 60 this year. You Mickey Mouse your playoffs by bringing in all these extra wild card teams. I think there's a really good chance this year's World Series champion, unless it's the Braves, I reserve the right to change my mind. But I really think this year's World Series champion will have an asterisk that they won during what is kind of a goofball, carnival type season. College football, if you play 10 regular season games, and right now that's the plan, you move to a college football playoff. Jeff, that to me, all you've really lobbed off are the Louisiana Monroes and the East Tennessee States anyway. To me, college football still feels very legitimate. It may have fewer fans. The games may feel a little bit different, but the results absolutely, to me, count just as much as they ever have.
Okay, first of all, I should have known better on a Brandon Adams piloted program here. But you asked for a yes or no question, and I gave you a no answer. I didn't know we would filibuster after this. I was trying to play by the rules.
You did right.
Here's it simple, Brandon. They're going to be the SEC champion this year. Vegas, talk to me, is going to have at least 9 conference wins this year. To me, that is the most robust, the strongest. That is going to be the strongest SEC champion in years. When you go through an entire 10-game conference schedule of SECs, you deal with the COVID. You're probably going to have to deal with losing starters for chunks and moving in a number 2 and a number 1 a lot of times, playing more your freshmen you ever thought you were ever going to. I think, theoretically, if LSU got hot in this same cycle this year, there would be an 11-0 record in the SEC, and folks, that would be a record.
Yeah, I think we may have to recalibrate what we think of as a good season. At least that's my opinion. But that's an interesting take. Let me finish with this. Cole Medlin, watching on YouTube here on Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau, says, will there be bowl games, not just the college football playoff? I think it's far easier for me to imagine the college football playoff taking place. The bowl games, I'm not sure of. Mike, do you think we have bowls this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think we'll have bowls, and I've heard different bowl organizers come out and say that there's plans to have bowls, and I think bowls could be more important than ever. I mean, let's see where we're at with the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, obviously some people are more apprehensive of flying for games than others. We've demonstrated that on our program tonight, but that could be a real celebration. Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a heightened risk for disease on flights. That's why we banned travel from China and Europe early in this crisis. That's a whole nother program.
Come on, no politics. No politics.
Wait a minute. This whole thing has been politics from the jump. Not Cover 4, but the college football.
So you think we're playing non-playoff? Yes or no? Non-playoff bowl games?
I do.
Jeff Sintel, non-playoff bowl games.
I say no, because, bowls are about fans in the stands. If we looked at the bowls for the last 4 or 5 years, 8 years, bowls, a lot of them, the majority of these bowls are propped up by universities buying 12,000, 15,000, 18,000 tickets and anybody getting them. And there not being a lot of grandeur at all. I mean, you got to remember, why are people going to go to the Pool and Weed Eater Bowl? Why are people going to watch the Pool and Weed Eater Bowl? I guess you could say it's programming for ESPN, and that's probably the point. I'm sure that my buddy Mike Griffith is saying right there, that the TV inventory still needs to be filled. But
isn't that what most of it is? I mean, isn't that what most of it is?
It is, but
because a lot of these games are fairly empty for the most part.
Yeah, but they're empty, Brandon.
For instance,
but they're empty, Brandon. But they're sponsored by each university committing to a 25,000 block of tickets that nobody ends up uses. Yeah. And all those events, the tractor pulls, the food eating contests, the trips to the all that, the parades, that's sponsored by a lot of the people filling up that ticket money.
Yeah, I mean, Chick-fil-A, not the restaurant, but the people that run the football game, they essentially said they couldn't afford to have these games at the beginning of the season if there weren't going to be fans in the stands. I mean, they basically made that pretty clear.
To answer the original question, no, I don't think we have bowl games outside of the college football playoff.
So let me finish the show by going back around with the opposite thing, especially for Connor and Jeff. What would it take to change your mind on that, or are you just 100% certain? I mean, is there a way? That we get there? Not playoff games, but bowl games.
A vaccine?
No, come on. There's not going to be a vaccine by December.
It's significantly decreased numbers to where we, as a country, feel more safe about going back out there and doing things. And the reality is, where those numbers are right now, most people do not feel safe and comfortable doing those things. That's not to say that we can't get there. And if you're going to ask me for a number, I can't give you a number. It's more of a feeling.
Well, what's the? I don't care about the coronavirus numbers. I'm asking you, what's the most fans that sit in the stand to watch Georgia this year? Your gut reaction?
My gut reaction, 0.
There's no fans at all?
I think they have to try, and they try to get fans in there, and I think it's a worthy endeavor to do so. But if NFL has no fans and MLB has no fans and NBA has no fans, though the NBA and NHL are obviously different with bubbles.
But the NFL is going to have some fans, though, right?
Not in some states, I don't think.
Jeff, what's the most fans that see a game inside Sanford Stadium? I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
It's fine. I don't need the satisfaction of finishing.
Sorry.
He doesn't need the satisfaction. He doesn't need the satisfaction of being right. You know, Brandon, I think the number's 15 to 25,000. Got to remember, I'm gonna answer your bowl point though, man. You got to remember safety, bubble-like, try to keep these young men safe. I mean, there's not going to be a bowl week. Why in the world does Georgia, or let me just say Florida, need to go to Tampa for a whole week leading up and get out of their routines and spend a week there being part of the bowl? I think the only way the bowls happen, man, is if they fly in and fly out. They do the TV thing where ESPN has a 4-hour block with commercials they can fill, and then get in and get out. I think the bowls will be largely a studio TV project.
I'd argue no one should ever spend a week in Tampa, just in general principle.
I'm with you on that. Mike, I'm going to give you the last word on the entire broadcast. What is the most fans that see a game inside a stadium for Georgia this year?
The model that I've heard they're working with right now is 30,000. So I'm going to
think it ever goes? I guess my question is, do you think it ever goes up?
Well, if you're asking me today, no. I do think there'll be advancements in time for the bowl season, though. I'm the glass is half full for me by January and maybe even February. There's nothing that says they can't move those games back a little bit. I guess it would depend on how many NFL prospects would stick around, et cetera. But I'm going to go with 30,000 BA. I'm going to stay positive. I think we're going to see some fans with some social distancing. Greg McGarity said fans would have to wear masks. That tells you they at least have a plan in place and anticipate one.
All right, Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau. Don't forget, all kinds of stuff on the website, dognation.com. Mike, good coverage, what went down with Greg McGarity today. Also, the official announcement from the SEC. Mike has tremendous coverage of that. Connor Riley's got some takes on this topic coming as well at dognation.com. Jeff Sintel, very interesting look at quarterback for the 2022 cycle, Gunnar Stockton, the page of dognation.com this morning. Also checking out his porch there as well. And I have been told to expect some big news from a 5-star of sorts weighing in on his recruiting process as well. We may get some of that from Jeff Sintel coming on the pages of dognation.com really soon too. Jeff going to be with us for Dog Nation Daily tomorrow also. So that's going to be really fun. We'll let y'all go for now. New time every Thursday, 6 p.m. It's Cover 4 Live with Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel, Connor Riley, and me, Brandon Adams, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau. We now know how many games Georgia will play. We know some of the teams that Georgia will play. We know who it's not playing. Sorry, Yellow Jackets. 2 more opponents to find out. It's going to be a fun news cycle over the course of the next couple of weeks. We'll look forward to covering it right here on Dog Nation and see you back here again next Thursday for Cover 4 Live, presented by the Georgia Farm Bureau.
Jeff, I like your porch.